The experience machine is a thought experiment devised by Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick. The context in which he proposed this thought experiment had to do with a question which Nozick hoped to answer. The question was, what defines a good life? If somebody asks you, how are you doing? And you say, I'm doing well, I'm good, my life is going pretty well, thanks, how's yours? Or maybe you might say, my life is not so good, it's bad, it's miserable. In all of those cases, presumably, you'd have to have some standard or definition or concept of what makes for a good or bad life. Now, one answer to this question of what makes a life a good life is known as hedonism. It comes from the Greek word hedone, which means pleasure. Now, a hedonist will say, therefore, that pleasure is the only thing that's good and pain is the only thing that's bad. This doesn't mean, of course, that other things may not be good or bad, but they're only good or bad as a means of producing pleasure or pain. For example, a hedonist will say money can be good, but only insofar as it produces pleasure. Money is good because it allows me to buy things like putting gasoline in my car. The gasoline is good because it allows me to go to work. The work is good because it produces more money. That money is good because it allows me to buy food and live in a house I enjoy, and so on. But all of those things are only good as a means to an end, and the end, of course, is producing pleasure. Now, the inverse would also be true. Things would be bad if they produce pain. So a bad grade could be bad precisely because it's painful or it produces a certain degree of sadness, which is a type of pain. So in sum, pleasure is the only thing that's intrinsically, that is in and of itself, good. If we ask people, well, why do you want to be pleased? Why do you want to be maybe happy? There's really no answer to that. And by contrast, pain is the only thing that's intrinsically bad. Everything else is only good or bad as an instrumental means to an end. The experiment then will go something like this. Suppose there was an experience machine that would give you any experience you desired. Super-duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or reading an interesting book. All the time, you would be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life experiences? Of course, while in the machine, you won't know that you're there. You'll think that it's actually all happening. Would you plug in? So the idea here would be, I'm not actually jumping out of an airplane or climbing Mount Everest or going to the moon. I'm only having experiences of these things. Now, Nozick wants to say that he wouldn't plug in, and he doesn't think that you should probably want to plug in either. And I don't think he thinks most people would want to actually plug in. And it's an interesting question, why? Before we get there, though, let's see if we can schematize this argument. I will use P to designate premise and C to designate conclusion. Premise 1, if experiencing as much pleasure as possible is what matters most to us, we ought to do whatever will produce the most pleasure. And of course, the hedonist will accept that if, that antecedent to that conditional. The hedonist will say, yes, experiencing as much pleasure as possible is really what matters most to us, or is the only thing that matters to us. Premise 2, if we ought to do whatever will produce the most pleasure, we should plug into the machine. Premises 1 and 2 together will give us premise 3. If experiencing as much pleasure as possible is what matters most to us, we should plug into the machine. Premise 4, we shouldn't plug into the machine. Now, I've bolded and underlined this precisely because this is the response that Nozick thinks would be reasonable to give. The whole argument here is really going to turn on this premise. So if we deny premise 4, the argument is not going to work. And again, exactly why we should accept this premise, why we shouldn't want to plug into the machine, is an interesting question we'll have to get to in a minute. But for right now, hypothetically, let's just accept that as part of our evidence. Premise 5. So experiencing as much pleasure as possible is not what matters to us. That follows from premises 3 and 4. Premise 6. If experiencing as much pleasure as possible is not what matters most to us, then hedonism is false. Premise 7. If hedonism is false, then some things other than producing the most pleasure matter more to us. Premise 8. Hedonism is false. That follows from premise 6 and premise 5. Now, conclusion. Some things other than producing the most pleasure matter more to us. That follows from premises 7 and 8. So, in sum, that's my rendition, that's a rendition of this argument. Now, Nozick provides at least 3 reasons for not plugging into the machine. He says, look, first of all, we want to have certain types of experiences of doing things precisely because we really want to do those actions. So it's not that I just want to have the experience of climbing Mount Everest or going to the moon. I want to actually go to the moon, and the machine can give me the experience. That's why it's called the experience machine. But it can't give me the actuality of doing that thing. So the machine falls short. A second idea would be that someone floating in a tank is just an indeterminate blob. Let's say that I'm in the tank or in the machine and I think that I'm falling in love. I'm not actually a lover of a particular person. I'm not actually somebody's partner because, I really have no identity in the real world as that person's partner because I'm not really their partner. I'm just an indeterminate blob of a brain or a person inside a machine that's synthesizing and faking these experiences. I can imagine I'm the great American novelist, but I'm not actually a great American novelist, so I don't have an identity as such, and that seems to be problematic. And a third thing we could mention is that there's no actual contact with any deeper reality, even though the experience can be simulated. So we have a kind of inner aspect of our experience here without any corresponding outer aspect of our experience. And Nozick will say that, therefore, falls short of our intuitions about what's really required for having a good life. Now, there are some potentially, in my view, incorrect responses to the machine. First of all, some people will say the machine would perhaps be boring, or it might even seem obviously fake to us, so why would you bother plugging into it? Well, in the first case, I don't think the machine would have to be boring. If you were to say, well, the machine would produce all of this pleasure, and let's say I would get pleasure from eating lots of steak and sushi every single day, and if I did that every day, it would get boring, and so therefore the machine wouldn't be that exciting. It would actually end up being less exciting or less pleasant than real life. Now, if the machine led you to that conclusion, then the machine actually would not be an experience machine that would produce the maximum amount of pleasure possible. But notice, if you were to say that you won't plug into the machine because it won't produce enough pleasure, you're actually a hedonist. You're really just denying the thought experiment. You're saying, well, no machine could ever produce that amount of pleasure. But Nozick says, look, the machine can take care of that, right? The machine can actually make it so that you're not going to be bored. Also, if you were in the machine and you were thinking, well, this can't be true, and that would somehow pain you, it would take away, it would detract from your experience of pleasure, again, the machine wouldn't really be doing its job. And again, that's more of a hedonistic kind of response. You're saying the reason I wouldn't plug in the machine is because the machine ultimately won't give me the kind of payout in terms of pleasure that real life might. And so I don't think that's a really good response to the machine. So assume for the sake of argument that the machine can take care of that. It can give you a full gamut of experiences that you want to have, and it won't bore you, and you won't believe it's fake. A second thing you might say, which I think is also wrong, is the machine may break. It may break down. It could be controlled by bad people. It could be a kind of matrix situation. Again, Nozick forewarns us. He says, don't worry that the machine it could malfunction. Because obviously, if you thought it could malfunction, then you might think, well, maybe I'll be harmed by it. Maybe the machine won't produce enough pleasure. It won't do what it's advertised to do. Maybe I'll be manipulated by people in a kind of matrix situation. In those cases, though, really what you're saying is the machine, again, doesn't really produce enough pleasure. It doesn't really do what it's advertised as doing. So Nozick says, just dispense with that. Dispense with that worry. And a final point here is, you might say the machine could disappoint us. We may choose the wrong sorts of experiences. So let's say that I could pre-program some experiences. I want to go to the Great Wall of China. I want to go to the moon. I want to go to Mars. I want to fall in love, and so on. And it turns out that you get into the machine, and the machine gives you those experiences, but you think, I don't really want these things. Well, again, don't worry about that, because in that case, the machine would not be really doing what it's supposed to do. The machine is supposed to produce the maximum amount of good experiences that you want to have. Now, I don't know if such a machine is possible, but that's what the thought experiment is really about. So in sum, if we choose not to plug in, according to Nozick, this is going to suggest that there's something besides pleasure that matters to us. Another idea that seems to follow from this is that our internal experience of something is not going to be sufficient for making our lives go well. So even if I have a warm and fuzzy feeling of falling in love, if I'm not falling in love with an actual person, if this is all an illusion, it doesn't seem like that's all that ultimately meaningful. At least that's what Nozick wants to say. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Nozick's right. I'm giving this to you as a possible way of reading this thought experiment. So you might ask then, what makes a life truly valuable and why? Is Nozick wrong? Do you think he's wrong? Would you plug in? Okay, I hope that you enjoy thinking about this. And let's talk again another time.